Picture this. You're Ambassador Kyle, 9 of the Zilani, and your entire civilization is getting eaten alive. Not metaphorically. Literally consumed by these crystal nightmare creatures called a void swarm. For 3 long, terrifying years, you watch entire star systems just vanish from existence. One day there's a thriving world with billions of your people, bustling cities, orbital stations humming with activity. The next day, empty space. Not even debris. Just nothing. Kyle stands in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, his translucent blue form flickering with patterns that any Zilani would recognize as pure desperation. Around him, representatives from dozens of species sit in their floating pods, but Kyle can see in their alien eyes fear, not just for his people, but for themselves, because everyone knows the Zilani had one of the strongest fleets in this sector. If the swarm could tear through them like tissue paper, what chance did anyone else have? The Zilani used to be proud. Really proud. They were master engineers, builders of some of the most beautiful cities in known space. Their crystal spires could be seen from orbit, reaching toward the stars like frozen music. Their people lived for thousands of years, had time to perfect art and science in ways shorter-lived species could only dream of. But pride doesn't stop crystalline monsters that treat entire planets like snacks. Kyle's voice cracks as he speaks through the universal translator, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Please, he says, and you can hear centuries of dignity crumbling in that single word. If anyone out there has mercy, help us. We're dying. The words echo through the chamber, and several alien representatives shift uncomfortably in their pods. Help? With what? The Confederation had already thrown everything they had at the swarm. 3 full battle fleets gone. Wiped out so completely that they didn't even have time to send final transmissions. The message goes out on every frequency, every channel, broadcast across the galaxy with the kind of desperate hope that comes right before extinction. Kyle knows it's probably useless. The swarm moves too fast, consumes too efficiently. By the time any help could arrive, there might not be any Zilani left to save. But what else can he do? Just sit and wait to be eaten? What Kyle doesn't know, what none of them know, is that his SOS just traveled way further than anyone expected. It bounced off relay stations, got amplified by deep space beacons, and eventually reached a little blue-green planet sitting all by itself on the galaxy's outer rim. A world so far from galactic civilization that most species don't even know it exists. Earth. And on Earth, in a cramped monitoring station that smells like coffee and determination, Dr. Beth Turner is having a night shift from hell when alien voices start crackling through her equipment. She's been listening to space chatter for 15 years, mostly picking up automated signals, an occasional merchant ship complaining about cargo delays. But this is different. This is someone screaming for help across the void. Beth doesn't speak a word of Zilani, but panic sounds the same in any language. She's recording everything, running it through the translation algorithms that her team has been building from decades of intercepted communications. And slowly, piece by piece, the message becomes clear. An entire species is being wiped out, not by war, not by disease, but by something that treats civilizations like food. Now, here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy hasn't figured out yet. See, Earth is what you might call a death world, a planet so hostile and dangerous that it produces species with a very particular mindset. Humans have been fighting for survival since they crawled out of the oceans. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plagues, predators, and each other. They've been dealing with bullies for their entire evolutionary history. And humans have some very strong opinions about bullies. Within 6 hours of Beth's discovery, every major government on Earth knows about the Zilani situation. Within 12 hours, emergency sessions are being held in capital cities around the globe. The debates are fierce but brief. Some argue they should stay hidden, avoid galactic attention. Others say it's not their fight, not their problem. But there's a third voice, growing louder by the hour. It's the voice that says when someone is crying for help, you don't ask if it's convenient. You don't calculate the odds or worry about the cost. You grab whatever weapons you have, and you run toward the sound of suffering, not away from it. That's the thing about Deathworlders. They don't just survive impossible odds. They charge headfirst into them, especially when someone else needs saving. Kyle 9's desperate plea for mercy is about to get answered by a species that has never learned how to back down from a fight. The galaxy is about to discover why you should be very, very careful about hurting innocent people when humans are listening. Dr. Beth Turner had been staring at computer screens for so long that her eyes felt like sandpaper, but she couldn't look away. The alien distress call kept playing on repeat, and every time she heard it, her heart broke a little more. These weren't just random signals or space noise. These were people, real living beings, begging for someone to save them from complete extinction. Beth had spent her entire career listening to the empty spaces between stars, hoping to find proof that humanity wasn't alone in the universe. She never imagined that proof would come in the form of someone's final scream for help. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago. But Beth didn't care. She was too busy running the message through every translation program she could find, pulling in linguists from universities around the world through encrypted video calls. Dr. Robert Chin from MIT, Professor Lisa Rodriguez from Oxford, Dr. Tom Bradley from Tokyo University, all working together to decode what might be the most important message in human history. And slowly, painfully, the full picture emerged. An entire civilization was being wiped out by something called the Void Swarm, and they were running out of time. Within 6 hours, Beth's little monitoring station became the most important building on Earth. Black SUVs started arriving, followed by military helicopters, followed by people in expensive suits who spoke in whispers and made phone calls that could start or end wars. The president was briefed. The prime minister was briefed. The Secretary General of the United Nations was pulled out of bed at 3 a.m. to hear about aliens asking for help. The emergency sessions that followed were unlike anything in human history. Every major government on the planet was suddenly dealing with the same impossible question. What do you do when someone from across the galaxy asks for help? The debates were intense, but surprisingly short. Some leaders worried about revealing Earth's location to potentially hostile aliens. Others questioned whether humanity was ready for interstellar conflict. But there was something else, something deeper that kept coming up in every conversation. Humans don't like bullies. Never have, never will. President Williams put it best during the emergency NATO meeting. If we can help and we choose not to, what does that say about us as a species? These people are dying, and they ask for mercy. Are we really going to pretend we didn't hear them? That's when Admiral Jake Morrison got the call that changed everything. Morrison was a career military man, someone who'd spent 30 years preparing for conflicts that might never come. He'd trained for invasion scenarios, space warfare, even first contact situations. But he never expected to be leading humanity's first interstellar rescue mission. Standing in the Pentagon's war room, looking at satellite images of shipyards around the world, suddenly buzzing with activity, Morrison felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The ships they were building weren't pretty. While other species in the galaxy apparently designed sleek, elegant vessels that looked like works of art, humans built something completely different. These were flying fortresses, massive chunks of steel and ceramic armor that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd watched too many war movies. And, in a way, they had been. See, here's the thing about human military technology. It's designed by a species that has spent its entire existence fighting. Not just fighting other humans, but fighting the planet itself. Earth doesn't make things easy for anyone. Hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, ice ages, asteroid impacts. Humans have been dealing with catastrophes since they first picked up rocks and decided to hit things with them. Every piece of technology they build has to survive not just enemy action, but the kind of environment that regularly tries to wipe out entire continents. The ships Morrison was looking at reflected that philosophy perfectly. Thick armor designed to shrug off nuclear explosions. Redundant systems that could keep functioning even after taking massive damage. Weapon systems that could operate in the vacuum of space, underwater, or in the middle of a planetary bombardment. The kind of ships you build when your home planet tries to murder you every single day. Look at them, Morrison said to his aide, watching construction feeds from orbit. They're not elegant. They're not sophisticated. But they're tough as nails, and they'll keep fighting long after prettier ships have turned into scrap metal. Within 3 days, something impossible had happened. Humanity had built its first interstellar war fleet, 1,000 ships that looked more like flying mountains and spacecraft. Each one was crewed by volunteers, people who'd signed up knowing they might never come home. Soldiers, engineers, medics, all united by a simple idea. Someone was in trouble, and humans don't abandon people in trouble. Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship, the UES Determination, looking out at the assembled fleet. These ships represented the best and worst of human nature, the capacity for both incredible violence and incredible compassion, often at the same time. "All right, people," Morrison announced his fleet commanders, his voice carrying across 1,000 ships through quantum communication rays. "We've got refugees under attack somewhere out there. Time to show the galaxy what Earth's children do to monsters." The fleet began to move, and humanity took its first step into a much larger, more dangerous universe. The first sign something was wrong came from tech specialist Kira, 12, deep in the bowels of the Zolani Orbital Monitoring Station. She'd been tracking space debris and refugee ships for weeks, her 4 eyes bloodshot from staring at sensor displays that mostly showed empty space and the occasional chunk of destroyed civilization floating past. But this time, the readings made her crystalline form pulse with alarm patterns that hadn't been seen since the Void Swarm first arrived. "Admiral Luke Prime," Kira's voice cracked through communication crystals, "I'm picking up massive hyperspace distortions. Something big is coming. Really big." She paused, running the numbers again because they seemed impossible. "Sir, I'm reading approximately 1,000 objects dropping out of hyperspace at the system's edge." Admiral Luke Prime felt his internal temperature drop several degrees. 1,000 ships? The entire Galactic Confederation Navy barely had that many vessels, and most of those were scattered across dozens of sectors trying to contain other swarm outbreaks. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe some distant civilization had finally answered their distress calls? But even as he hoped, something felt wrong about these readings. When the human fleet materialized at the edge of Zolani space, the first thing that struck every observer was how absolutely terrifying they looked. These weren't the elegant, curved ships that most galactic civilizations preferred. These weren't the sleek vessels designed by species who valued art and beauty in their technology. These were something else entirely. Brutal, angular monsters that looked like they'd been designed by someone whose only experience with engineering involved figuring out better ways to destroy things. The human ships were massive, each one easily twice the size of a standard Confederation cruiser. But it wasn't just their size that sent waves of panic through the surviving Zolani population. It was how they were built. Thick, geometric slabs of armor plating covered every surface. Weapon ports bristled from every angle like the spines of some deep space predator. Heat signatures blazed from their engines with an intensity that suggested power plants capable of running entire cities. These ships didn't just look dangerous. They looked like they'd been specifically designed to survive and inflict maximum damage in environments where everything else would simply cease to exist. "By the ancestors," whispered Communications Officer Beth 7, her voice barely audible through the translation matrix. "What kind of species builds ships like that?" Admiral Luke Prime stared at the tactical display, his worst fears crystallizing into horrible certainty. These ships were arranged in perfect military formation, not the scattered, desperate formation of refugees or the organized but peaceful arrangement of a rescue fleet. This was an invasion formation, the kind of precise, overlapping coverage pattern that military strategists used when they wanted to ensure absolutely nothing could escape their firepower. The panic that had been simmering in the background of Zolani society for months suddenly exploded into full terror. Emergency sirens began wailing across every surviving colony, their haunting tones echoing through crystal corridors and sending civilians scrambling for whatever shelters still existed. Parents grabbed their younglings, elders were helped into reinforced bunkers, and the few remaining Zolani military personnel rushed to whatever defensive positions they could manage. Luke Prime's hand shook as he opened emergency communication channels to every survivor in the system. Unknown hostiles inbound. All civilians to emergency shelters immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat. All civilians to emergency shelters. Prepare for planetary bombardment. His voice carried the kind of desperate authority that comes from someone who knows they're probably giving their last orders. Meanwhile, Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship, completely unaware of the terror he was causing. From his perspective, everything was going exactly according to plan. The human fleet had successfully completed their first interstellar jump, arriving precisely where the distress signals had originated from. His ships were in perfect defensive formation, ready to engage whatever hostile force had been attacking Zilani. Every weapon system was powered up and ready, every shield generator running at maximum capacity. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Commander Amy Foster from the tactical station, "we're detecting multiple Zilani installations throughout the system. Some appear to be heavily damaged. Others show signs of recent combat. But I'm not seeing any sign of these void swarm creatures the distress calls mentioned." Morrison frowned, studying the tactical display. Where was the enemy? The distress calls had made it sound like the Zilani were under active attack, but the system seemed relatively quiet. Maybe they'd arrived just after battle? Or maybe the swarm was using some kind of stealth technology his sensors couldn't penetrate. "Keep scanning," Morrison ordered, "and prepare to broadcast our arrival on all frequencies. Let these Zilani know that help has arrived." What Morrison didn't realize was that from the Zilani perspective, help looked exactly like extinction. The human ships were so far beyond anything in the Galactic Confederation's military that they appear to represent some kind of super-advanced warrior species. Ships that could probably glass entire planets without breaking a sweat. The kind of overwhelming technological superiority that civilizations use when they want to send a very clear message: surrender or die. Down on the surface of the last major Zilani colony, families huddled in emergency shelters carved deep into their crystal cities. Children who had never known anything but war and evacuation clung to their parents, while elders tried to maintain dignity in what they were certain were their final moments. The beautiful spires that had once reached toward the stars in celebration of Zilani achievement now served as desperate hiding places from what appeared to be the galaxy's most terrifying military force. The stage was set for a catastrophic misunderstanding. On one side, humans who had traveled across the galaxy to answer a cry for help, expecting to find grateful refugees and hostile monsters to fight. On the other side, the surviving Zilani, convinced that some warrior species had arrived to finish what the void swarm had started. Neither side understood what the other was thinking, and both were about to make decisions that would change everything. The shooting started when a terrified Zilani defense platform opened fire on Morrison's flagship, mistaking his "we're here to help" transmission for some kind of attack order. See, here's the problem with first contact. When you don't speak the same language and you're already scared out of your mind, everything sounds like a threat. The automated defense station's operator, a young Zilani named Tim, had been awake for 36 hours straight, jumping at every shadow and sensor ghost. When this massive human battleship started broadcasting what sounded like combat frequencies directly at a station, his panic took over. The energy blast that hit Morrison's flagship was pathetic by human military standards, barely enough to scorch the paint on their armor plating. But it was still an act of aggression, and human military doctrine has some very clear rules about responding to hostile fire. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 3 Zilani defense installations simply ceased to exist, vaporized by nuclear fire that lit up the system like miniature suns. Morrison watched the tactical display with growing confusion. He'd expected the Zilani to either welcome his fleet with relief or at least try to coordinate their defense against the void swarm. Instead, every Zilani ship in the system was running away from his fleet as fast as their engines could carry them. Not just tactical withdrawal, full-blown panic flight, with ships scattering in every direction like startled fish. What the hell is going on here? Morrison muttered, studying the sensor readings. The Zilani weapons were hitting his ships, but they might as well have been throwing pebbles at tanks. These weren't military-grade weapons. They were the kind of light defensive systems you'd use against pirates or asteroid debris. "Lieutenant Foster, are you seeing this? Their weapons are barely registering on our shields." Lieutenant Commander Amy Foster was hunched over a tactical console, her face pale with confusion. "Sir, I'm reading massive power signatures from Zilani ships, but they're not powering weapons. They're overloading their engines to try to get away from us. And, sir," she paused, double-checking her readings, "some of these ships are civilian transports, family vessels. They've got children on board. That's when Morrison realized something was terribly wrong. This wasn't a coordinated military response or even a desperate last stand. This was pure terror. The Zilani weren't fighting them. They were fleeing from what they thought was an extinction event. But why would they be afraid of a rescue fleet? The answer came from an unexpected source. Petty Officer Danny Rodriguez had been working frantically in the communications bay, running Zilani transmissions through every translation algorithm the human fleet possessed. Rodriguez was a linguistic specialist, someone who'd spent years studying alien communication patterns from intercepted signals. He'd been making slow progress with the Zilani language, but suddenly everything clicked into place. Admiral Morrison to the bridge. Emergency. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the ship's intercom, and Morrison could hear the panic in the young officer's voice. Morrison rushed to the communications bay, where Rodriguez was pale and shaking as he played back translated Zilani transmissions. The first voice was from a Zilani parent, broadcasting to her family scattered across different ships. "The Deathworld species have come for us. Tell the younglings I love them. This is the end." Another transmission, this one from a Zilani military officer. "Unknown warriors are systematically destroying our defenses. This appears to be a mercy killing. All units stand down. Do not provoke them further." Morrison felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "They think we're here to..." "What?" "Finish them off." Rodriguez nodded miserably. "Sir, from what I can piece together from their communications, they think we're some kind of advanced warrior species here to complete their extinction. They're calling our arrival a final mercy. They think we're here to kill them quickly instead of letting the void swarm drag it out." The horrible truth hit Morrison like a freight train. These people have been fighting for their lives for 3 years, watching their entire civilization get consumed piece by piece. They were traumatized, desperate, and when a fleet of ships that looked like mobile fortresses showed up and immediately started shooting, they assumed the worst. From their perspective, some terrifying military power had decided to put them out of their misery. Morrison grabbed the ship's intercom. "All ships, immediate ceasefire. Ceasefire now. Weapons cold. Shields to minimum power." He turned to Rodriguez. "Can you broadcast in their language?" "I think so, sir, but my pronunciation is terrible." "I don't care if you sound like a broken translator. Tell them we're here to help. Tell them we heard their distress call." "Tell them?" Morrison paused, trying to figure out how to explain that humans had traveled across the galaxy just because strangers needed help. "Tell them we're friends." The next few hours were a nightmare of miscommunication and desperate attempts at diplomacy. Morrison found himself trying to convince an entire civilization that his fleet of terrifying warships had actually come to save them, not destroy them. It was like trying to convince someone you're friendly while wearing full battle armor and carrying enough weapons to level a city. But slowly, painfully, understanding began to emerge. Zilani's ships stopped fleeing and started cautiously approaching the human fleet. Communications improved as both sides worked frantically to establish proper translation protocols. Morrison even managed to speak directly with Admiral Luke Prime, though the conversation was awkward and full of misunderstandings. "Where is this void swarm?" Morrison kept asking. "We're here to fight them." Luke Prime's response was always the same. "They come and go like storms. We never know when or where." Morrison was starting to wonder if they'd made the journey for nothing when space itself seemed to tear open 12 hours later. The void swarm had arrived, and both species were about to discover what they were really capable of when they worked together. The void swarm hit the human fleet, like a tsunami of living crystal, and nobody was ready for what happened next. Admiral Morrison had been in the middle of another awkward conversation with Admiral Luke Prime, trying to explain through broken translation software that humans really were there to help, when space itself seemed to crack open like a broken mirror. What poured through that dimensional tear looked like something out of nightmare. Thousands of crystalline entities that moved like living asteroids, each one the size of a city block and pulsing with malevolent energy. "Contact!" Lieutenant Commander Foster shouted from her tactical station, her voice cutting through the sudden chaos on the bridge. Multiple hostile entities emerging from... "I don't know what that is." "Sir, some kind of spatial distortion. They're huge." Morrison felt his stomach drop as he watched the tactical display fill with red enemy markers. This was what had been terrorizing the Zolani for 3 years? These things looked like they could eat planets for breakfast. But then his training kicked in, and Admiral Jake Morrison became exactly what Earth had trained him to be, a warrior who didn't back down from impossible odds. All ships' battle stations formed a defensive screen around Zolani vessels. Let's show these things what Earth's children are made of. The Void Swarm's first attack was everything the Zolani had warned about and worse. Energy beams that could slice through starship hulls like butter, crystalline projectiles that moved faster than most missiles, and some kind of disintegration field that had turned Galactic Confederation ships into space dust. The Zolani fleet, what was left of it, immediately began retreating to what they hoped was a safe distance. They'd seen this dance before, and they knew how it ended. But something incredible happened. The human ships didn't disintegrate. They didn't explode into pretty fireworks or get sliced apart like all the other fleets that had tried to fight the swarm. The massive energy beams that should have cut through their hulls just splashed harmlessly against armor, plating designed to survive direct nuclear strikes. Crystalline projectiles that moved at ridiculous speeds just bounced off shields that had been built to deflect asteroid impacts. "Sir," Foster reported, her voice filled with amazement, "their weapons aren't penetrating our armor. Hull breaches are minimal. Our shields are holding at 85%. Morrison grinned, the kind of savage smile that comes from realizing your enemy isn't as tough as they pretend to be. These things have been picking on civilizations that build art instead of armor. Time to show them what real military engineering looks like. But what happened next was something that would be talked about in Zolani history classes for generations. Instead of engaging in the long-range energy weapon battles that most galactic civilizations preferred, Admiral Morrison gave an order that made absolutely no sense to anyone who hadn't grown up on a planet that actively tried to kill its inhabitants. Launch boarding pods. All Marine units, prepare for hostile vessel infiltration. The Zolani, watching from their retreating ships, couldn't believe what they were seeing. The humans were actually approaching the Void Swarm entities, getting closer instead of farther away. And then, in a display of tactical insanity that defied all military logic, human Marines started boarding the crystalline creatures. Actually boarding them, like they were enemy ships instead of living nightmares. Sergeant First Class Tommychin was leading the first boarding team, and he'd been training for zero-gravity combat his entire career. But nothing had prepared him for fighting inside a living creature that existed partially in normal space and partially in some other dimension. The interior of the swarm entity was like being inside a crystal cave that kept changing shape, with walls that moved and floors that weren't always where you expected them to be. "Contact front," Chin shouted into his helmet comm as something that looked like a cross between a spider and a chandelier came skittering out of the crystalline walls. The humans opened fire with weapons that shot depleted uranium rounds and explosive shells designed to work in vacuum, the kind of overpowered infantry weapons that only made sense when your home planet regularly threw hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions at you just to keep things interesting. The battle inside the swarm entities was unlike anything in galactic military history. Human Marines fighting hand-to-hand with creatures made of living crystal, using combat techniques developed in the worst environments Earth could produce. They moved through the shifting crystalline corridors like they'd been born for this kind of fighting, adapting to impossible conditions with the kind of stubborn determination that comes from being raised on a world that never stops trying to kill you. For 3 days, the battle raged across the Zolani system. Human ships tanked damage that should have been impossible to survive, while human Marines fought their way through the guts of creatures that existed partially outside normal reality. It was a kind of insane, desperate combat that only works when you're from a species that considers surviving impossible odds to be just another Tuesday. When it was over, the Void Swarm was extinct. Not defeated, not retreated, completely wiped out. The crystalline entities that had terrorized this sector for years were nothing but glittering debris floating in space. Ambassador Kyle, 9, found himself standing in the ruins of his capital city, looking up at Admiral Morrison. The human was scarred, tired, and covered in crystal dust from 3 days of impossible warfare. But he was smiling, the kind of genuine warmth that comes from someone who's just helped a friend. "Thank you," Kyle managed. his translator struggling with the emotional complexity of what he was trying to say. Morrison just shrugged, like he'd done nothing more impressive than help a neighbor move furniture. Someone was in trouble. We came running. That's what neighbors do. And in that moment, Kyle understood something that would change the galaxy forever. These humans weren't just warriors. They were something much more dangerous. They were a species that had weaponized their compassion just as efficiently as their rage.